Well, let's get more than on this from economist Richard Wolff. He's author of Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Richard, good evening to you. Republicans are saying there's little hope for a last-minute negotiation like there was with the fiscal cliff. Are you any more optimistic?
No, I think that Republicans and Democrats alike are committed to an austerity policy as we see it in Europe. Their only disagreement is exactly who gets cut, whose taxes get raised. And I'm very pessimistic, as are most observers in Washington, that we are about to do what Britain, Italy, Greece have done with the same dire consequences looming in our future.
Well, if the cuts kick in, will that really combat that huge deficit or not? Surely it's a debt that can't go on much longer.
No, it won't. That's what the Europeans have been learning. If you cut government spending, as we're about to do, if you raise taxes on average people, which we did on January 1st with the rise in the payroll tax, those are a double whammy, two hits on our economy. They depress the economy. They lose people jobs. They make people cut back in their spending. With less jobs and less spending, government tax revenues go down, and that erases whatever benefit you might have imagined would come to the government's budget. The irony is the economy gets worse and the government budget gets worse until they wake up and realize that this is an inappropriate way to go at a time of economic crisis. Let's remember, the budget deficit of the government took off in 2007 and 8, which is because we had a crisis. If you solve the deficit without dealing with the underlying crisis, it will not work.
I mean, what you're saying there makes total sense. How come this is still happening? Both Republicans and Democrats knew this sequester was inevitable. Why this blame game now, this last-minute thing? And we covered this at length, of course, we were talking about the fiscal cliff at the end of last year. Here we go again.
The irony is, and it's also a tragedy, that the very forces, mainly in finance, banks, insurance companies, and other large corporations, who have the major responsibility for bringing the crisis, and who then made sure to bail themselves out with borrowed money from the government, are now insisting that since the government borrowed to bail them out, it must suddenly show the kind of budgetary prudence that was out the window when it was the time for their bailouts. They want everybody else to pay for the bailouts they got, and the cost of that is an economic crisis. But they seem to care less about that than making sure they get taken care of and they don't pay the cost of the crisis and the bailouts, which they are mostly the beneficiaries of.
So briefly, what is your prognosis for later on today, and how's it going to affect Americans and indeed the rest of the world as well?
We're going to have cuts. We may have a last-minute piece of political theater, as we did with the fiscal crisis, but when the dust clears, as it did with the fiscal crisis at the end of the year, taxes on average people went up much more than any tax on rich people. And when the dust clears, with or without a last-minute deal, we will have spending cuts that will damage our economy and that we will regret as we do this crisis now 5 years old for years to come.
Richard, a final thought. President Obama wants to replace the sequester, doesn't he, with this package of cuts he's proposing, adding up to $1.5 trillion over 10 years. Is that a workable solution or another sticking plaster?
Well, I think it's another cutback. It's another caving in to the forces of business and finance. It will not solve our problem any more than his past programs and that of his predecessor, George Bush, have been able. Let's be clear. This crisis is now in its 6th year, 5 and counting. We have an unemployment rate that isn't even halfway back to what it was in 2007 before this crisis began. If we don't get better, radically different policies, we're going to look at a long-term downturn that is going to remind everyone, as it already does, of the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Richard Wolff, economist and author, thank you for your thoughts tonight.